It might be the most general observation that can be made, and yet it's so resonant, and that is leadership is hard, right? And leadership is even more hard for individuals who are operating on the outside of institutions, within and yet on the outside of institutions. And so as I have each of our panelists discuss their leadership roles, I hope that they will talk about something that was challenging along the way, and about their general reflections on being a leader within AADS and beyond to the university at large. I'd like to start, let's see, is Angela's not here. Uh-oh. Let's see if we can find Angela.
I have emailed her, so let's just give 1 second for her to
Okay.
be joining as an attendee if we wanted to go to the next panelist.
Sure, we can absolutely do that. I think if Shelly, would you be ready to start us off?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to just recognize that everyone is a leader, even though their name or their place may not be at the head of the table. We all participate in the process of leadership, and we all have goals that we push towards the front of the table, and we all have a voice. And our voice can be used in many different ways. We do not have to be the head or the director of the program to often have the influence or the say or the sway in what's going on in life around us. And so I want all of us to understand that as we move through the various different roles that we have in our lives, in our classes, in our organizations, within the business world, within academia, and then within our careers. And I'm saying this to say that you don't have to have the title of director or CEO or CFO or whatever the top title is at your organization to work towards change and to work towards more important goals for you and whom you identify with, and then to be able to realize those goals. I want to talk a little bit about my journey into leadership, and it's not something that I aspired to do. I began my academic career here at UNCG rather quietly, moving into a department, not knowing the process of the things that were happening. I would often sit quietly at faculty meetings and just listen to what was going on as I learned the ways of academia. If you spend time in academia, you know that every university does things different, and every department and program within universities does things differently, even though there are lots of similarities. And I would sit quietly and listen. And I use this time to sit quietly and listen to understand the dynamics and the process. You learn a lot about who talks a lot, who doesn't talk a lot, who has what to say, who doesn't have anything to say, who advocates for the group and whom advocates for themselves. And you learn this just by listening and paying attention. And then once I felt that I had a handle on what was going on, that's when I began to speak out. And it was probably about 2 years into my position. My first 2 years, I spent taking notes at meetings, which was perfect because you didn't need to speak. You just needed to pay close attention to what everyone was saying. And I noticed something interesting, and it's been written about in the literature. We'd ask for ideas in these meetings, and I would give a suggestion. Silence, crickets. Move on to the next person. About 10, 15 minutes later, someone would paraphrase what I said. Oh, wow, that's a great idea. Oh my goodness, yes, let's talk about that. I thought, okay, that's the first time. It happened again, and it happened again. And then I said, well, this isn't by accident. And it wasn't just one person, it was a collection of people doing this. And I remember I pulled aside a colleague and I said, it's interesting. I said, have you noticed? And of course, this colleague said no. I said, watch. We went to a meeting. I said something, crickets. 10 minutes later, a colleague, and usually it was a male colleague who would paraphrase the same statement. And it was heard coming from this colleague. And after the meeting, this colleague of mine, who also happened to be female, said, oh my gosh, you're right. Told you. And we developed a strategy. So then we told a male colleague who didn't believe it happened either. We set up another experiment, we did it. And so what we did was we started a system in these department meetings with this sympathetic male colleague of saying, hey, that's a great idea. I believe that's what Shelly said earlier. Or, hey, that's a great idea. I believe what this person said earlier. And so we started the process of giving voice to the voice that wasn't notarized or heard for their statement. And there were a small group of us, and it's something that's continued over the years, that we give voice to those voices that seem to not be heard by the more powerful in the group. It's something that I do in my classrooms. I notice one student will say something and it doesn't get much traction. Another student will follow up on that statement and it gets a little bit more traction. And I try to remind the class of okay, so you're following up on the statement of this person. Okay, because we like to get credit for the things we do, especially when it's positive. But as I've gone through leadership, I had to move from that person who wasn't heard in the room to the person at the head of the table. And that has been a wild transition. My role into leadership, again, was not something that I planned. I ended up being an interim program director for AADS when it was AFS, when the current program director went on research leave for a semester. And that semester was really easy. It was really smooth. My AADS colleagues were fun, easy. They listened, they heard my voice. We were a collective. Maybe it's because it was a smaller department. I believe it's because there are some other dynamics at work in the department, but we all worked well together. And through that course of that semester, we did some great things. We did what needed to be done, and we all felt positive at the end. And I was happy. Then, probably not even 6 months later, the department head in my home department in sociology became ill, and we needed someone to step in. And according to my colleagues, I was the best person to step into that role. And I later understood why I was deemed the best colleague is because I was not the troublemaker in the department. I had not delved into factions. I can say I was factionless. I engaged with everyone. I didn't have a clique. I listened. I was thoughtful. I was not boisterous at meetings. I thought for the good of the department versus my individual desires. And I think that is a reason why many of my colleagues thought that I should be the department head at the time. And it was an interim position. However, I will say that as I moved into that position, relationships changed, dynamics changed. Maybe it's because the department was bigger. Maybe it's because we were also doing this at the time that the university was in a financial crisis. But a couple of things that I learned about leadership at that time is that probably goes against a lot of the leadership literature that's out there. Be as open as you can and involve everyone in everything. And while there's lots of leadership out there that says, let's devise groups to make plans. Whole group planning is problematic when you're in your classes. Think about when you're in your class and your instructors put you into small discussion groups versus large discussion groups. I found that whole group, large discussion groups for whole group planning for the department was the best, because sometimes when people aren't invited to the table, they feel that the decisions are being made without them, and against them, and they want to know what's going on. Maybe not necessarily to change what's going on, but just to know what's going on. And so I thought I was doing everything the business world had said, put together work groups to work on ideas and topics, float through the work groups the same way an instructor will do in a classroom, and then have the groups present back. But I realized that as a result of doing that, I was accused of having a secret group that made all of the decisions in the department. And so I said, all right, everything's going to be a group effort. Who wants to join me? Again, there were crickets, but at least I think the knowledge is there. So transparency, I believe, is very important when you are a leader of color. And you have to find your way into the aspect of transparency, because as a person of color, as a woman, what I was doing was always questioned and not necessarily believed by those. So I made everything transparent. And once I figured that out, things went a lot better. Um, don't lose yourself if you move into a leadership role. It's hard, but whatever those characteristics are in yourself that you like and admire and that you know that people like about you, keep those. So I had to continue my kindness and my determination and my strength while I was in my role as department head. And sometimes it takes more time to be kind to everyone, but you'll find a way. There's a way to be kind and make sure everyone's voice is heard and not have 2-hour-long meetings. And I think that this is where your colleagues, your group that supports you is very helpful for that. As I sit here and think about a few other things that I've learned about leadership, I'll just leave you with this one tidbit as we move forward, and I'll pass the mic to Cerise as we keep going, or Dr. Glenn, is that one of the things I learned in a leadership training years ago was that women often apologize for things. Women often say, I'm sorry. And I was in a leadership training with a woman in the business world, and she said, ladies, stop saying I'm sorry. Stop apologizing for things that you have no control over or things you cannot control or weren't even involved in. And I thought, wow, well, that's interesting because, you know, I'm a very sympathetic person. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. But I changed my language. And so instead of saying, I'm sorry, as if I took responsibility, I started labeling the situation for what it was. That's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that that happened to you. And it felt good to not take ownership, because sometimes when you take ownership of something you don't have responsibility over, somewhere in your psyche, it creeps in that maybe you also need to fix it. And so one of the things I learned, and this is something that I pass on to all of my female colleagues, and I'll pass on to you, is that stop saying sorry for things that you didn't do and that you can't control, but instead say things such as, that's unfortunate. It's sad that that happened, you know, that makes me sad. And if there's a way that you can offer assistance, go for it, but you don't have to take responsibility for all of these things. And I'm going to pass it now to Cerise.
Thank you, Dr. Brown-Jeffy, and thank you, Dr. Morrissette, for inviting me here this morning. I'm excited to talk with you all about some leadership experiences for Black women, and I'll talk about leadership in general. I'm going to share my screen for a few moments to get started. There we go. Okay. So part of the work I do in leadership and activism is through my research area and also through my applied experiences. So this is a flyer for a course. I'll talk you through some of the images, particularly Stacey Abrams in the book that Dr. Morrissette mentioned in my introduction. One of the things I'll say about leadership in general, particularly for Black women, is that the issues go beyond, of course, those of us who are on this panel, or even beyond directing African American and African diaspora studies. There's a larger discourse of tensions between self-definition and agency and marginalizing discourses that you have to navigate in ways that you don't let others suppress your voice, but you get to find some sense of empowerment that requires quite a bit of pivoting or navigating setbacks, attacks, silence, and even omission. I like to use this quote by Stacey Abrams. It's a little small on the screen, so I'm going to read it for you as well. That she's one who's credited with turning Georgia blue in the last election, but she's been a leader for a lot longer than that. So it's one of those, she's popular now, and it took 10 years to do what she did in that state after going through a setback of losing an election. But one of the things that she says is, quote, "I'm not going to change my hair, which a consultant suggested I do. I was not going to fake a boyfriend. If I find him, great. But I wasn't going to pretend that he existed to create some notion of relationship. I wasn't going to wait until there was a more opportune moment for someone with my complexion," which was also a suggestion. She also didn't feel that she needed to lose any weight. Quote again, "I refuse to let someone tell me that I am less than because they think my body is more than me." So I think Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris is also on this slide. Give us ways to think through how we navigate that tension of, you're going to be in this role of leadership, but it's going to come with some backlash and challenging discourses that must be negotiated. And the picture of her in the top right corner asks us to not look at her as a magical Negro. She's not going to save the world. So within the overtly sexist and racist discourse that she's had to navigate, she's still expected to swoop in out of this cape and be a savior of sort. So part of what I'll say about leadership is that when you hear people like Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams talk, you realize that they cultivated who they are as leaders long before they stepped into public recognition. Like Dr. Brown-Jeffy mentioned, that sometimes you may not be at the helm, but you're still a leader. For me, I was moved into leadership most of my life in ways that I didn't necessarily volunteer for, but just because I challenged things that I thought, why does this have to be this way? So one of the first experiences that pops into mind when I was working on these particular remarks is that, well, there was an association in my high school that was called Future Teachers of America. Initially, I wasn't going to join, but I was recruited into it. But FTA, as it was called, was aimed for women in particular who wanted to teach in the K through 12 environment. I say, I'm interested in education. I'd like to learn more, but I'd like to be a professor. The shock was, what? No, we teach kids. That's not what I was interested in doing. But there was no organization for women or people in general, but really for women who wanted to teach beyond the K through 12 level. So that's something I had to create. So I did run for president and took on leadership roles, but also extended that on to how can we communicate or connect to colleges nearby. And I went to high school in Raleigh. We have colleges nearby. So it wasn't like that was an unheard of task. In rural areas, I may get that, but where we were, it was pretty easy for us to move on to college campuses and do that type of work. So I find myself not looking for leadership roles, but just by asking questions and challenging certain things about what it is I'm supposed to do with my life and who I'm supposed to be, ended up in leadership positions. So part of what most people in leadership, I think it's an interesting dynamic for Black women, is learning how to articulate and share your voice within that legacy of self-empowerment, but also you have the same legacy of racism and sexist discourse as well. There's times where you're gonna have to channel through pain and difficult experiences. And I've learned over my life to take those moments and move them into something that I can be proud of and I can share with others and to inspire other people as well. So example I give with this book I just published called Womanist Ethical Rhetoric, what ended up being a very, very difficult and challenging experience was I lost my mother a couple of years ago. And she's the reason why I study STEM women of color in the STEM field. She was a math major in the 70s. And she worked in an environment where she was not only the first African-American, she was the only woman. And I watched her navigate as a child and later into adulthood, her experiences in that environment, and realized she in many ways was also ahead of her time. Her death was devastating and crushing to me, but I also wanted to make sure I paid honor and homage to her in the work that I continue to do. So even when I wrote that book, some of the journaling I did ended up becoming the introduction. That some of the experiences from my mom's generation and from your mom's and maybe grandparents' generation is that the career options and leadership options were very limited. My mother grew up in the rural South where she worked at a mill, and the expectations were for her to either stay in the mill or to go into teaching or nursing. She ended up taking an education minor because that was passive, that pacified my grandfather, her dad. Because that's what, if you're going to go to college, which he did not understand, you had to go for nursing or for education. So she did that in addition to all the requirements it took to be a math major. I've also learned some painful lessons of enacting self-care. That was actually one of the pivotal moments that told me I was done being the director at the time. The program itself is an amazing program. It's grown quite a bit over the years. Dr. Frank Woods and Professor Coffin have been there for several years and can tell you really great stories about how they've developed and grew the program. One of the things that makes AADS a little bit unique to UNCG is that it's a program, not a department. Because of that, it's small, and I'll stop sharing my screen. I think people have a chance to. So that means you have to wear more hats. So I came into AADS from a much larger department where there's more of us to delegate and to do certain things. So for instance, it's a job that ran sometimes 6-7 days a week. And Kalia was with me as a student before she became the program coordinator. She's on this chat as well. But she can tell you how she's gone with me to events called Spartan Showcase on Saturdays, because I'm in a department where there's not 2 people delegated to do that. That's me. And it just gets, those days get to be long. There's you get to do meetings with search candidates of color. So even if candidates come in who aren't in your department, you'll often be one who they want to meet with. And if a position has 2 to 3 candidates and there's so many searches happening, we're not right now because we're in a pandemic, that just eats up a lot of your time. And what makes it challenging is that you're happy to do it. I enjoy talking to people's parents. I enjoy talking to prospective students. I enjoy talking to prospective candidates. I like working with CACE. I enjoy the Black History Month program, although it's very exhausting. But there's an enrichment that comes with that. But it is a lot. It's a lot of hats. So I've had to learn to say no. It's easy to say no to things I don't want to do. It's challenging to say no to things you do want to do. But I've had to learn to take a step back and say, I'm only one person. There's only so many hours in a day. I can pick and choose the things I want to focus on, and then you can recruit the strong talent to help delegate things to. So I mentioned Kalia by name because she's one who started out as an intern and one of our students and is now our program coordinator, doing a great job helping to support CASE and keep it running in the background. There's a pride that comes with developing student leaders like her and others. You get to present at things like ERSCO or Undergraduate Research Conference. I've taken students to NCBS, which is our National Council of Black Studies. They went to Atlanta and I was incredibly proud of them. And we talked through some of the work we did with creating and sustaining an internal internship program. You also get to have great engagement and collaboration with others who also wear many hats. On this campus, that's been with the Lloyd Honors College, the sustainability, creative programming that you get to do. One of them that stuck with me was we were able to bring in a speaker when we were actually still meeting on campus. And her talk was the myth of strong Black womanhood and a new mandate for self-care. So one of the things I hope those students who attended took from that is, as you're navigating all those tensions, not to forget to take care of yourself, and that you don't have to accept the role to save everybody all the time to the expense of your own self-worth and self-care. So I mentioned that to say, as I mentioned, my mother passed away a couple of years ago. That was just a time where I said, I appreciate the position I'm in. I love the work that I'm doing, but unfortunately, I did not have the option to mourn her passing. Because another unfortunate set of circumstances, we had a faculty member who passed away right after my mom did. And then I had to replace and quickly pivot over the holiday break his classes. And so being a leader often can mean putting the needs of that program or putting the needs of whatever you're leading ahead of your own. But I reached a space where I had to say, hey, there's other great leaders on this campus. Dr. Morrissette, Dr. Brown-Jeffy are great examples of that they can take on this role while I give myself time to pivot and move into a different space. You also get to recruit and to support great talent, which is something that you don't think of as a leader, but it's a really important task to see up and coming leaders and to be a part of their journey and their development. And you hope that as you move on and your legacy continues, they'll pay that forward and mentor and nurture the ones coming behind them. You also get to learn quite a bit about your own strengths and skills and learn where you need areas of development. I'm one, and this is not just me, it's those of us in communication studies, love dialogue and consensus building. And then you end up in an environment where you have to turn in a report on budgets in 2 days. And you're thinking, I don't have time to talk to people. So sometimes you have to make these executive decisions when you don't have the option of talking to people in ways that you would like. You learn to shift or pivot in critical moments that can be works in progress. So for instance, a pandemic. I was still the director when the pandemic started, and we had to do an incredibly fast pivot to remote learning. That was unprecedented for most of us. And now all of a sudden I do tech support, and I'm having to get people laptops and having to figure out how things like Zoom work. So that's how you just can't see that stuff coming, but you have to be able to pivot and roll with that. And also to think through ways in which you can take those challenging experiences and turn them into opportunities for more experiences. So even though I'm not necessarily a leader in the program anymore, I still have the privilege of leading our NSF Advanced Grant that promotes gender equity for women in the STEM fields, along with Dr. Brown-Jeffy. And she and I worked on that project for 7 years before we were able to successfully get that grant approved. Also to take on different roles. I'm now the vice president-elect for the Organization for the Study of Communication, Language, and Gender. That's a national organization. So like you can think of the smaller things you do, high school, college, wherever you may be right now, leads into a university role, which is now for me leading into a national role. And there have been challenges, but I've enjoyed that process, and I've liked the person I've become and that I hope to still be, but also look forward to cultivating my own leadership skills as I mentor and work with those students who are coming behind me as well. And I will turn, I think, oh, Dr. Rhone is back. I'll turn it over to her.
Yes. Mhm. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. First, let me say, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can't
Yes.
see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, okay, my dear. Thank you so much. Let me first say thanks for inviting me. I really don't even know where to start, but I have a few minutes, so I'll tell you the journey. I decided to do my doctorate in North Carolina, and I chose UNCG. And I need for you to understand that I had no idea what North Carolina was all about, because I grew up between Jamaica and New York. I got my bachelor's and master's in New York in literature. And then I think I heard someone, I know this is again, talk about taking risk. And I said, okay, I'm going to go to North Carolina. And there it was. No money at that time could come out of Jamaica, because we were having this confusion, not realizing we just got independence from England. And the question was, who owns Jamaica? Was it England? Was it Castro? Was it whoever? Was it Russia? So there was, how should I say, a put then on money that could come out. So I said to myself, I wanted to do this doctorate here, but where would the money come from? So again, taking risk, I decided to apply for the job as a hall director. And then I said to myself, that's where I began to see my leadership skills coming out. I did it for 4 years on one of the dorms at UNCG there. And while I was doing it, I was writing the dissertation, going to and from Jamaica. And the question that we're asked is, and I think my journey is going to be a bit different from yours, is like, what held me together at UNCG? I literally was the only Jamaican on campus for a long time. I know a Jamaican student came on and then he left after 6 months. So I was there by myself forever and ever and ever. But one of the things I say that held me together is the whole idea of how I grew up in Jamaica, listening to African folklores. So when you think of the journey of the African from Africa to the Americas, to the islands, to everything, and stripped of everything and clothes except for two things, his mind and his folklores or her folklores. And I remember as a child growing up in Jamaica, we sitting down together at nights and just starting talking about these folklores. And that was passed down from generation to generation. And what for me stood out is the leadership of these, how should I say, small animals to take over and to not run the plantation, but in truth and fact, they did run the plantation. And so for me, the strength of their work, of these slaves, or to be able to contain themselves and to live, for me, it stuck in me. So one of the things that my first idea about leadership is get to know who you are, get to know what contains you, what's your, where did you come from? So for me, understanding African culture, I was able to build myself at UNCG because it was an alien culture for me. It was quite interesting. At the end of the doctorate, I think the university said to me, you know, if I wanted to teach African American studies. Again, I need for you to understand this, because this was kind of always very, very powerful for me. I didn't even know the Jamaican culture that much. And then, so you can imagine, I did not know the African American culture that much, and the African culture where our ancestors were coming from, we didn't do it. What we were taught in Jamaica, really everything was British centered. So what I did was I really built a narrative that was focused on detail. I got the books and I just studied. I was one day ahead of the students because I did not know it. So the first 2 years were quite challenging, but I had several friends. And I heard you call their names. Michael, if you're there, I say hello. Frank, if you're there, say hello. And Pat Bowden, I will never forget Pat. Pat was one of the secretaries in religious studies. So they were, I can't say, and I've said it because I'm getting very emotional. If I were to die this minute and Jamaica doesn't want my body, bury me in North Carolina and let my friends Pat, Michael, and Frank, because they supported me 100%. From there, the program just grew, and we developed, I developed different courses. Students started taking the courses. I'm not even sure if I think when I got the letter from Dr. Morrissette, and I looked at all the things that the program, how the program had expanded, I was like shocked. I couldn't believe it, because this was a program that started with just 2 classes, with Angela not even knowing where she was going, because I just finish the doctorate. And we invited different speakers. I remember Maya Angelou, Cornell West. I remember several people coming to UNCG to speak. And during the African American History Month, I would do so many things, and people would be there at nights, just to take part in the programs. And as I grew, I began to realize that how so many things were left out of my education, both in Jamaica and the bachelor's and master's in New York and the doctorate here at UNCG. And so it's as if I couldn't get enough. So what I'm trying to say is, in terms of leadership, one, go back to where you're coming from, know your history, your folklores, what maintained the journey from Africa to here. The second one I'm saying is, like, for leadership, don't be afraid to take risks, because I took a risk at UNCG, which for me, seeing this today, it's unbelievable. What I did do, because there was not a Jamaican community around me that I could lean back on. I didn't know about a Jamaican community until about 5 years after I was there. So my total, how should I say, envelopment was in the African American culture. And so I studied it, I studied it, I studied it, I studied it so much. And because I didn't know it, I was like overly anxious going into classroom. I was more than prepared to teach. And I think another leadership that I did was this whole idea of creating a book club. And the book club was for really faculty and staff. And we would meet once per month, and we would discuss books and would eat, but it was a form of community. Again, this whole idea of community coming out of the Jamaican culture and the African culture and the folklorish culture, that also helped me to grow up and to understand this new community that I was in. I became a role model for students, and I helped, I think, in addition to myself and to the others, understand one's culture, how very important this is to the essence of one's life. After 6 years of doing this, I went to University of New Hampshire. Again, let me explain. University of New Hampshire, honestly, again, I took a risk. There were, I think at that time, I was the first Black woman in about 100, the first Black woman in about 100 years, whatever, taught at the university. So they was kind of very powerful there. But I think I was asked to teach there because of the essence of my work in African American studies, able to bring a different culture to the classroom and to my teaching. I taught, what I was trained to do on was that the history of education. I taught in the College of Education, the foundations of education. But don't forget, no, the essence of my being was centered in African American work, Africa, and the Caribbean. So I taught those classes, the college, the education courses in the context of African American studies. Who got what? How did each ethnic group get an education? And so women's studies, all of these, LGBTQ, all of these, the absence or non-absence of these ethnic groups to get a quality education in America. So I was combining two things, my doctorate in curriculum and instruction and what I'd done at UNCG, the ethnic part of it, and it became very, very powerful. I felt that I New Hampshire was not for me. So when the lonely and just out of my wits. So I applied for a job here in Florida, and I got the job. And when I came on, I was asked to teach multicultural education. So really now I'm informed now by several different things. I'm informed by my work at UNCG. I'm informed by my work on my dissertation, which was to look at Jamaican's history in the context of British oppression. And I lived in New Hampshire for a year, and now I was being asked to teach multicultural education. That's James Banks and Christine Seater, all of these people. So again, now can you imagine what my work was like? And I wrote several papers on those issues, and it was kind of very, very interesting. Since here at FAU, I have, I again was in the curriculum and instruction, but we separated, and I was teaching, I'm now teaching educational psychology. Again, no, don't forget, this is a different discipline. I could have said, okay, I'm going to go, but I was here. Now, what shapes my teaching in EdPsych? Okay, you have the textbook that I use as 17, has 17 chapters. There's one sentence in chapter 1 that talks about the work of Mamie and Kenneth Clark. All right, the Doll study, DOLL-STDUI. And nowhere else talks about the work of African American or people from the African diaspora work in educational psychology. So here is it now. I'm taking the leadership of Angela, what must you put together? So my students are asking EdPsych from the first chapter to do work on EdPsych people who are not talked about. George Sanchez, Mexican American, Lita Hollingworth, a white woman, and Mamie and Kenneth Clark, and several other minority ed psychologists. So I think for me then, what it has proven is that, Angela, leadership is very complex. It's not only, you can't just concentrate on your discipline. You have to be able to, I don't want to use the term spread out, but you have to be able to look at other disciplines and bring them together. And that's what I encourage my students to do. Some of the challenges that I've had, okay, at UNCG, I got a Fulbright grant. This was very, very interesting. This was the year when I was leaving, and I got it to take a group of master's teachers in literature to Jamaica. And I think it was 13 master's students from North Carolina who applied for the trip. Again, I need for you to understand the powerfulness of this. All the teachers were world literature teachers. Did you know anything about Jamaican literature? And one or two said, honestly, we didn't even know there was literature coming out of Jamaica. They had, many of them had traveled perhaps to Ireland and all those sorts of places that they had read about, but none had ever been to the Caribbean islands. So for 6 weeks, I had them there, and it was a big challenge. And what I realized, the challenge was that getting to people to move from one location to another is not diversity. It took 6 weeks, first 9 to 12 in the mornings, I taught, and then 12 o'clock until about 6, 7 o'clock, we looked at on buses, the history of education in Jamaica, the plantation system, the oppression, England having us for 300 years. And out of that, I showed them, or we discussed where Jamaica's literary works came from. And it was kind of powerful. Several left before the 6 weeks. A lot of tension, don't forget in Jamaica, we don't have the racial tension that I faced when I first came here. But the group that came, they came with that, they came with it. So there was a lot of racial tension between the groups, Black and white teachers. And I've asked several of us who have gotten Fulbright grants to developing countries or to third world countries, and they're saying that, Angela, this is what we experienced. So that was a big challenge for me. The question is, would I do it again? And the answer is no. Okay. A challenge I face here at FAU is that I'm teaching in a discipline that does not really talk about people of color in the discipline. That means then throughout the semester, I have to exposing my students to these ethnic groups that are not in the textbook. So it takes up a lot of my time. So writing for me is like the biggest thing. But in terms of anything else, I'll stop and questions can come up later. Thank you.
So,
hello, yeah.
Hello, I'm here. I always forget to unmute. I guess I need more Zoom practice. So I do want to say to our audience members, and we have a vigorous audience here, please ask questions in the Q&A and I will direct them to our panelists, okay? And it's open to anyone who's attending. We do have several comments here, so I will share them with the panelists and you all can see fit to respond. So Pat Levitin says, working so hard with fair fight against voter suppression daily. Stacey Abrams is fighting the fight. We also have from Pat, kudos to Kalia for an amazing virtual CACE this year, best ever. And then also from Pat Levitin, women wear more hats than the men, very common on campuses. And I wonder if any of you would like to respond to that last observation.
I'd like to add something right now. And this is a theme that's been going through the conference, and it's a theme that has been in the Spartan Advanced Group work that I'm doing with Cerise and my other colleagues, is that one of the things that women in leadership, that Black women in leadership, that marginalized folks in leadership have available to them is that they have the opportunity to change the narrative. And we can change the narrative by normalizing, by being unapologetic for the parts and aspects of our lives that are important. We've recently been talking about the idea of normalizing and making part of the narrative parenting. That, you know, walking into a meeting when you're at the head and don't say, I'm sorry my kids have to be here today, but just walk in and say, my kids are here today and let me introduce them to you. They're going to sit in the corner and we're going to continue this meeting. And so by not being apologetic, by taking ownership of it and saying, hey, this is just life and it normalizes the fact that we wear the many hats, as Pat says, or the multiple hats, and that these hats are just one of our identities. And when you walk, sometimes when you put on one hat, the other hat doesn't go away. It's not switching hats, it's just hats piled up on your head like a TikTok challenge or something. But we wear all of these hats, and we don't always get to pick and choose which one is the biggest one, or the one that's on top, or the one that's on the bottom. And so we can normalize these conversations. We can make a paradigm shift to change the way that organizational structure exists. And this is part of speaking out. And you can change this system. You don't have to be the person at the head of the table. Sometimes you can have just as much power by knowing the key people in power than being in power. I'm known as a troublemaker around campus. And there are some folks who, when they need something said to the right people, will say it to me and I can get the word out. Sometimes these people have protected status. So when you're looking at tenured versus untenured faculty members, or lecturers and instructors who work on 1 and 2 year commitments, I'll say contracts, they often cannot say things for fear that they won't be renewed. Whereas when you're tenured, you have a little bit more job security. And I will often say what needs to be said, what's been told to me, and speak up for those who are on these contracts, knowing that they can't say them. I also happen to know a few of the key people around campus. And when a couple of things are going on that aren't widely spread or have been snuck into the last sentence of a Campus Weekly document that no one probably read carefully enough, I've gone to a couple of the key people that I know in leadership and say, did you know? And they're like, no, I didn't know. And it's like, that's interesting. You say, did you know, to about 3 of those people? And because they have the power and they understand that maybe what's going to happen is problematic, and if they don't understand, you can explain to them why, you have done your role as a leader, even though you're not in that leadership position. So like as I said, being the CEO, being the department head doesn't mean that you aren't a leader or can't advocate for change. But when you are there, we need to find ways to normalize and make folks normalize that we all wear multiple hats, and these all multiple hats are part of what we are. And often what makes people good leaders are these combinations of other traits and hats that they wear that give them the qualities that we think make them a great leader.
That's so nicely put. Does anyone else want to respond to that?
To echo some of Dr. Brown-Jeffy's points about the narrative quickly, is that one of the things about wearing the different hats is that the hats may get, or the roles get placed on you. But like what Dr. Brown-Jeffy says, sometimes you have to wear the hat in the way that it's defined, but there's also opportunities to redefine that discourse in ways that can shed light on the extra labor you have. So I think for me, one of those moments was in the summer after we had a new wave or awakening of social justice issues after George Floyd. And I was asked if I wanted to write a piece about, what it's like to be Black in the US. Now, other people wrote that piece and it was beautifully well done, but that's not the story I want to tell. If I'm going to be a spokesperson for this moment, I'm going to write a piece on allyship. I'm going to talk about what some of the rest of y'all need to be doing, because you don't need to necessarily hear my story. There's podcasts, books, there's plenty of ways you can understand it. But I don't feel like the way the narrative was being is like, let me tell you my painful story so you can learn about my pain. No, I'm going to tell you how allyship needs to work. Here's some of the things we've been doing. Here's how you can help those of us do this work. And I used our grant as an exemplar. Like there's not enough of us, people of color, women of color, in some of these roles. We're going to need some other people to raise their voices and to join this fight and to take on some of these hats that we wear. So I'll say that, the dominant narrative is not just here, but in many places is when something happens to a marginalized group, let's have the marginalized group fix that problem. We didn't create the problem. We'll be part of the solution, but some of the rest of y'all need to also be part of that solution.
Nicely put. And I think, you know, you're all talking about advocacy and actually doing things, right? You know, not so much maintaining a discourse of representation as much as doing something about it, right? Dr. Rhone, I wonder if you have ideas about this. It seems like in a lot of your narrative, which is going up and down the Eastern coast
Yes.
here,
Yeah.
it seems as if, you know, there may be an idea of like a static leader, that people who are just coming to thinking about leadership roles might be thinking about an idea of a leader who is completely outside of themselves, right?
Yeah.
You know, some other experiences. It's not me, it's that other person across the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like in your story of your own personal development and professional development, you're talking about expansion and this ability to sort of, it is many hats. It's a little overwhelming.
Yes, it is.
But it also seems as if one of the things that you're valuing about your experiences is sort of expansion and moving outward into subjects that take you places and can take other people places.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to speak to that more, or
I think I think when you talk about and the more I thought about it since last year when I was invited, as Black women, and you also have to understand that I have the double thing of being Black and immigrant, you know, and so I mean, for the past 4 years we have been hearing so much about the immigrant in this country. We have always heard. So in terms of expansion, what do I tell my students? The road that I went through, I encourage them to do extensive travel, okay? And you might have to take risks, because when I first started at UNCG, as I said, no money was coming out of Jamaica, okay? Because we had just gotten our independence, and we were like 30 years after independence, so we had nothing. Okay, so I took the risk then, and I encouraged my younger student, take risk. And I took the risk of becoming a hall director. I knew nothing about a hall director. But what it did expose me to was this whole idea of community. So teaching for me really is a community affair. I don't do, even online when I am teaching, all my students get a chance to know each other. It's not just, my class is not just a regular online or synchronous teaching class. Is that they must go and talk with each other, get into groups. So for me, in terms of leadership, the whole idea of teaching as a community is very much a part of me. And the idea then of taking risks, and I learned that from the African American community. I mean, no group has ever taken more risk, and that's all I do. I read work on African American history. I can go from the day when our bodies were thrown here and in the Americas. That was always it. You know, that was always a part of the culture. So it became a part of my culture too. And they expose yourself to other cultures. I have done work on Native American culture. I didn't know that I would do this. I am more now familiar with the LBGT culture because I had to study it. So you're saying that the whole idea of expansion, yes, I do believe that, because I take those into my teaching. How do you, I usually ask my students, how do you explain the pandemic? how do you explain why so many of us as African Americans get the virus and death comes to us closer? So although it is an EdSci class, my students have to understand all these issues in the sense of educational psychology. So when you say that, for me, my leadership and my journey has been one of really extending myself and be prepared to learn and be prepared to get hurt, because at this moment here, you know, I know I teach from two different angles: a pedagogy of connection, and also, and I came up with this recently, a pedagogy of forgiveness, because if I don't reach that stage, I will not be able to teach. Because if you look at the history, both of the Caribbean and the Americas, and take it to heart, you're not going to teach. You know, I went to England and I stayed in England for some time, and you know, the only thing I could think of is that in England was that, oh my God, this country had us for 300 years. You know, and we've just not long got our independence. So if you the idea of extension is good, but you have to, as a leader, you have to, I don't know if it's forgive and move on. I really don't even know what, but you just take these things into consideration as I teach.
So we have only a little bit of time left, about 5 minutes. Thank you all for your responses. I want to pull on our audience questions that we have here. Jacqueline asks, it's interesting to see how women, especially Black women, have had to create their own opportunities, and sort of how Dr. Glenn was saying, it's not always a choice to wear those hats. You sort of have to, but it's an important role because she's setting a path for other young women. We have Kimora Sullivan, who says, can any of the speakers give advice on ways to advocate for yourself when battling with intersectionality of being a Black woman? Does anyone want to respond to that question straight off the bat?
Sure, I will. First, thank you. I appreciate the first comment you read. And to the second one, intersectionality is challenging because you often have to shift when the focus of the discourse shifts. So to give an example, I talked through one of the pieces I write, and then even just who I am on social media. When we're talking about African American culture, there's sometimes a hidden sexism and homophobia that doesn't get engaged. And so one of the things I will say is when people make these comments, particularly, there's a lot of men of color, particularly Black men in some of these groups, who have things to say about Stacey Abrams. Like, one is, where's her man? Like, she doesn't need one. But what I will often say is, you know, Stacey Abrams doesn't hear you. Kamala Harris doesn't hear you, but you know who does? Your sister, your daughter, your mother, and other females around you. And what do you want them to take away from that comment? And then ask them to explain it. So I've learned to put moments out there as questions. And coming up in my home environment, like I'll never, well, never, he's passed away, would say to my grandpa, that's sexist. But you will ask, you know, why would you expect mom to go to college for education? And if she didn't, you would support her. And then when I want to go into education, or why is it you want me to teach kids, but there's a problem when I want to teach adults? And just by asking those questions can be a way of advocating, because it's hard to do that when you're in a community of people you love and care about. And sometimes they don't get it. When my grandpa passed away, my other grandpa at 91, you know, that's when I realized he was proud of me. He just didn't have the language or discourse to say it. But when you're one of the few who goes to college, he just didn't get why women wanted a college degree. In my family, they're military, and the men go to the military. My generation, we have some females in the military, and he was proud and supported them. So I say that you can advocate for yourself in ways where it doesn't come across as, I think some people think advocate means combative. You can just ask questions and say, why are you articulating this way? What does that mean? And sometimes it's just those questions of why can't I teach college? People are like, I never thought about it. I guess you can, but this is what we do here. And that's how you get in some of those leadership roles. And particularly when working with, another example was working with white women, you get challenged with, we went through some training or program where we're talking about our bodies in the workplace and how men often think they have the right to touch or comment on your body. Had all this great discussion about that. And on the way out the door, somebody took it upon themselves to touch my hair. Excuse me. We just had a conversation about my body. And when it's just about gender, you're like, okay. But you think it's okay to touch my hair and my body. And so I'm just like, we just had this conversation walking out of the meeting. So to say, no, pause, why are you touching my hair and why do you think that's okay? So those are ways you can kind of advocate for yourself that gets people to think about their actions in ways that doesn't make you feel like I have to be the one to call out all the racism, sexism, or homophobia in the room.
I also want to add that you should acknowledge your intersectionalities, but acknowledge that they're your own experiences. So I've been in the room when someone looks at me and says, so Shelly, you're a Black woman, what do you think? And I've answered, I'll say, well, as a Black woman, I see this, but I don't profess to speak for all Black women. Maybe you should ask some others. And as a Black female mom married, I also see these saying, these are my identities that you missed as well. These are the things that I see, but also reminding my colleagues who don't look like me and share my identities that I am one voice. And I will not speak for everyone that looks like me. And I'm going to remind you that I am not speaking for everyone that looks like me. I am speaking for myself. And I also want to say that for Mollis Whitley, who you're interested in an academic career field, some of the advice I'll say is that first, listen and see and watch and observe. You'll learn a lot about structures. You've heard the statement, when you see something, say something. Say something, but through your watching and observing, you'll learn whom to say that something to. And sometimes it's the person that can make the biggest change, but sometimes it's also just the person that you know will hear you. Sometimes you just need to be heard. You don't want to make the change, but you just need to be heard. And watching and observing helps you find those people. If you are not at a point where you can speak up, and some of us are born speaking up, we're the loud children, we're the loud baby in the nursery. And then some of us take time to develop our voices. We're the babies where parents are like, oh my gosh, your child's so quiet and they sleep through the night. How is that possible? We find our voice when it's necessary. We find our voice when it's that time. And if you haven't found your voice yet, it's okay, but find that person that can help your voice be heard. And that's part of the individual growth. We as women leaders on this panel, we found our voice, and we've also found our ways to help other voices be heard. So we're here to advocate for you and to help you find your voice along your journey towards leadership. Because remember, you're already a leader just by being here at UNCG.
I love that. And I think that's a beautiful statement for us to conclude with. I feel like this is the beginning of a conversation, certainly not the end of it. And I'm so grateful to each of our panelists, Dr. Glenn, Dr. Brown-Jeffy, Dr. Rhone, who are representing these years of leadership, both within the program and beyond the university. And as Dr. Brown-Jeffy says, both in the role, but also in their individual voices. And I hope that you will stay tuned for our next panel coming up, which is For Us, By Us, Black Women Scholars Finding and Maintaining Support During COVID-19. That is a different link than this one, so you'll need to exit and then come back in on that Go link. Thank you all for a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in future AADS events. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.